There is a name that still sounds like vault doors closing and ledgers being locked: J.P. Morgan. For generations, that name carried images of gilded rooms, carriageways, and a private city within a city. To many, it meant finance and influence, but behind the public ledger, there was a house on Madison Avenue that quietly held a darker counter-narrative. Between limestone facades and the buzz of traffic, the mansion kept rooms where deals hardened into policies, and corridors where the lives of servants and scions braided into something both elegant and uneasy. Today, we are going to cross that threshold, map the mansion room by room, and listen to how plaster, oak, and marble recorded not only a dynasty, but also secrets that time almost forgot. First, we will stand at the Iron Gate on Madison Avenue and let the city recede. Then, we will follow the stairs up to a ballroom that has not seen light in decades. The protagonist of this story is not any single man alone, but a family enterprise made flesh in stone. By the end, we will see how architecture became both shield and witness, and why an abandoned residence can still shape a city's memory. Let us begin at the mansion itself. On that stretch of Madison Avenue, the house looked almost ordinary to hurried passersby, a stoic block of Georgian limestone squeezed between commercial facades. The Morgan Mansion began life as a residence meant to impress, yet to conceal. Purchased at a moment when the family sought a private stage in the center of the metropolis, it was altered and expanded so it read like a compendium of wealth. High windows framed in carved stone, a porte-cochere the color of old bone, and a garden courtyard that smelled faintly of boxwood and coal smoke even in spring. Inside, mahogany floors bore the patterns of the household's footsteps. The dining room preserved a faint scent of centuries of roast and port. Servants passed in whispers along the back stair that creaked under bare feet. Children ran their palms along wainscoting polished to a soft glow and left grease marks that curators much later would debate whether to remove. There were portraits that watched like judges, and a library whose air tasted of glue and dust and diplomacy. Those rooms held routine and ritual. They also held the first crack that would widen into ruin. In the afternoons, the mansion vibrated with the city's distant clatter and smelled of horse manure from carriages. At night, the windows turned like eyes toward the avenue lights, and the sound of a distant piano sometimes floated up from a parlor's basement. "Do you think they know what goes on upstairs?" asked Eleanor Bradford, the young archivist who first pried open the boarded windows. "They see the plaques and smile, and never imagine the back rooms," replied Thomas Whitaker, an old conservationist who remembered the family when it still hosted winter dinners. "There is something in the floorboards," Eleanor said, tapping a faded knot of wood that resonated like a hollow drum. "We are not here to judge," said Margaret James, the project lawyer. "We are here to document." "Document everything," insisted Lucille Archer, a local reporter. "Even the ugly parts." "Even the secrets," added Robert Hayes, the building's caretaker, who had refused to leave when others fled. Those exchanges were not merely procedural. They were the first human voices to cross from the street into the mansion after years of silence. The air smelled of old paper and lemon oil. A distant radiator clanked like a sleepy heartbeat. Dust rose in motes and tasted of old ink. The light through the grime softened features and made portraits look almost forgiving. A moment of tension arrived the night the first crate of ledgers was forced open. For decades, family papers had been rumored to hold more than balances. When a brittle ledger slipped and spilled a column of names across the floor, the room seemed to exhale. Hands hovered. A lamp threatened to topple. Someone whispered a name that had not been spoken in the estate for a generation, and the very idea of that name made a descendant on the property stiffen. For a beat, the past and the present folded together. The incident forced choices about custody of records and pitted legal heirs against historians. It revealed that the mansion did not only shelter furniture, but claims and counterclaims that would shape decisions decades later. From private ritual, the mansion had, early on, become a stage where finance and public life collided. Rooms were reoriented. A breakfast room turned into a strategy office. Corridors were widened to accommodate pressing entourages. An annual gala became a scraping instrument of social proof. Reporters were occasionally admitted, and photographs were farmed like favors. The public image was carefully managed. Inside closed doors, the house was a center of soft power. Its West Study hosted shadow consultations that had consequences beyond the city. Restoration was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a tactical one. A great marble mantel was re-gilded, as if to refresh a memory of stability in volatile markets. The mansion became a symbol as much as a residence. Yet the conversion of private rooms into public stages also exposed fault lines. The marble steps could not contain the friction between image and truth. There was a short backstory of the figure most closely associated with the mansion, a figure who embodied both accumulation and restraint. He rose from a provincial childhood into the metropolis with an appetite for order. He learned to read ledgers by candlelight and to value certainty above sentiment. He believed institutions mattered more than individuals and invested not only money but a vision of permanence. The mansion in Madison Avenue was his assertion that money could translate into architecture, and that architecture could be a bulwark for a particular idea of society. Yet his public victories were shadowed by private losses and a growing suspicion that the systems he trusted were themselves fragile. In private correspondence, he often posed questions about stewardship, about what one owed to posterity versus to present needs. These notes would later surface in courtrooms and archive rooms and would shape disputes over inheritance and preservation. The mansion found a winter twin in a quieter estate uptown, where walnut panels absorbed light and where snow on the lawns muffled the unease of business hours. There, the family retreated in bitter cold and made decisions with the hush of fireplaces as witness. The winter house had a different architecture and a different set of rituals. It smelled of pine and coal and of inked telegrams. There, decisions were framed in more intimate terms. On a snowy February evening, a small conclave sat around a table of maps. The conversation between Henry Caldwell, a longtime family counsel, Dr. Miriam Lang, an advisor on art provenance, and Jonas Reed, a security man whose hands carried the memory of late-night deliveries, moved from logistical to moral. "If we give the papers to the museum, it will be interpreted," said Caldwell, tapping a particular spot on a map. "If we hide them, history will assume our silence is guilt," Lang replied, her voice thin as glass. Reed kept quiet and listened to the crackle of the fire. That house allowed decisions to be made away from cameras, but not away from consequences. Sensory notes there were sharp. The cot and blanket fabrics were heavy. The room smelled faintly of citrus used to cut through coal smoke. The wood table was smooth under the palms and sometimes sticky from spilled brandy. A larger backstory of the family enterprise stretches across 3 paragraphs and draws us into the complex formation of power. In childhood, the founder learned the logic of exchange at a small counting house where he watched shipments arrive and depart. He carried home the smell of tar and rope and invented a private language of credit that sounded like compassion to some and calculation to others. In his formative years, he worked long nights negotiating letters of credit and learned the thin line between reputation and ruin. A loss in midlife reshaped his appetite for risk. After a tragic market collapse that took friends and competitors, he became more guarded. Publicly, he rebuilt trust through philanthropy that bound his name to museums and libraries. Privately, he tightened the circle of those who could pass beyond the front door. In the present day, these early choices echoed in how the mansion was kept and in who had a key. The family valorized continuity and thus weighed the cost of revealing uncomfortable papers against the risk of dismantling a cultivated legacy. The urban life around the Madison Avenue mansion amplified contradictions. As skyscrapers rose, the mansion sat like a relic and adapted. A suite in the back became a penthouse-style apartment for visiting dignitaries. The neighborhood smelled of coal and gasoline in the age of transition, and later of perfume and hot dogs as the avenue commercialized. The family reacted to urban pressure with acts of preservation and concession. They donated a wing to an institute for the arts to demonstrate civic responsibility. They lent paintings to museums and hosted symposiums on architecture. The mansion served as a catalyst for debates about patrimony. When the financial press published a series of stories about opaque donations, the family took steps to distance itself and to reassert that the residence was a place of legacy, not of laundering reputations. Names like Inspector Jonas Reed and Dr. Miriam Lang appeared in footnotes to court filings. Lucille Archer wrote a piece that suggested the mansion was perhaps too self-conscious in its preservation. Public perception shifted, and the mansion began to belong less to the family and more to the city imagination. One of the most charged confrontations occurred when a whistleblower delivered a trunk to a city archive and claimed the contents contradicted the mansion's public narrative. The trunk contained correspondence that suggested influence peddling in a key municipal vote. Emotions rose. The whistleblower was ostracized. Lawyers mobilized. Newspapers printed underlines. For a week, the mansion seemed both a monument and a crime scene in the public mind. Patrons canceled galas. The family council met in secret to decide whether to release documents or to fight in court. The tension was not only legal, but moral. If they released the letters, they risked disillusionment among those who trusted the family. If they suppressed them, they risked a scandal that would outlive any legal victory. The city watched, and the mansion, which had once offered refuge, now offered only more questions than answers. Inside the mansion, another role emerged as an intellectual salon, where bankers, politicians, architects, and artists argued until midnight. The center of ideas was not a formal room, but a pattern of small gatherings around a long table, in a conservatory filled with palms, and in a library where the light slanted low. There, the conversation roster read like a who is who. Attendees included Dr. Miriam Lang, an art historian who debated provenance with vigor; Eleanor Bradford, the archivist, who pushed for transparency; Thomas Whitaker, the conservator, who spoke in practical terms; Margaret St. James, the lawyer, who cautioned restraint; Robert Hayes, the caretaker, who had the most intimate knowledge of the mansion's hidden spaces; and Senator Daniel O'Neill, who once used the house as a quiet place to rehearse speeches. Discussions were often electric. "We are caretakers, not curators," Lang would say. "Intent matters," Margaret replied. "Intent can be weaponized," Thomas argued. "Do we preserve the whole truth," asked Senator O'Neill, "or curate a narrative for stability?" Eleanor countered. Those were five-layered exchanges that did not resolve easily and that left the mansion both a cradle of ideas and a testing ground for ethics. When the talks turned to the architecture, they became sensory. The smell of hot tea, the scratch of fountain pens on paper, the soft pressure of velvet seats, the temperature change when a window was opened to let out cigar smoke. Those moments combined the intellectual and the corporeal. A second moment of tension came during a restoration debate when contractors discovered a clandestine room sealed behind a false wall. The room contained objects that implied a different relationship between business and personal favors than the family had acknowledged. Consultants argued about conservation ethics. Journalists smelled a scoop. The family threatened litigation. The discovery lengthened the list of actors and complicated the mansion's narrative. For a fortnight, the sealed room became both shrine and accusation, and made clear how architecture can hide actions that historical narrative then struggles to reconcile. Architectural legacy is not only about style, but about signals. The mansion blended Georgian symmetry with a careful vocabulary of old money gestures. Porticos and pilasters suggested order. Heavy draperies whispered discretion. A grand staircase given to a dramatic entrance also served to separate household from guests. The library was organized to communicate erudition and restraint. Materials told stories. Carved oak that suggested continuity. Marble mantelpieces that implied permanence. Brass fittings that showed a family comfortable with both display and durability. Yet there were Mediterranean touches in the conservatory, and an attempt at modern lines in a rear breakfast room that betrayed later tastes and the family's willingness to be seen as current. Critics called it a compendium of eras and of ambitions. To preservationists, it was a case study in how inheritance looks when it is cultivated into a brand. To artists, it remained a site that could be reinterpreted and reclaimed. Preservation fights unfolded in public commissions and quiet meeting rooms. The family eventually transferred a suite of rooms to a foundation and placed key artifacts on long-term loan to a museum. A preservation commission evaluated the mansion and recommended partial restoration and partial deaccession. Donations followed and protests too. Neighborhood groups argued the property should become affordable housing. A philanthropic trust proposed an educational program. Legal arrangements were drafted with the care of an archivist folding fragile papers. Experts such as Thomas Whitaker and Dr. Miriam Lang were called to testify about surface conservation and provenance. The result was a compromise that left parts of the mansion as a preserved museum and other sections to be used for community programming. The decision reflected an uneasy balancing act between private inheritance and public patrimony. The mansion that once signaled exclusivity now had to accept interpretation. A final intellectual tension came when curators decided whether to exhibit the disputed correspondence. The choice was to contextualize and risk reputation, or to hide and risk revisionist discovery. The debate brought together ethics scholars and community leaders, and once more revealed that the mansion's walls were not neutral. They mediated whose stories were told and whose were omitted. 1 month after the formal agreement, the mansion opened 3 rooms to tours. The tours were limited and curated. Visitors smelled lemon oil and old books. Guides like Eleanor Bradford explained in measured sentences how the family had shaped finance and how the mansion had been both refuge and instrument. People lined up with cameras and reverence. Press coverage noted the restraint of the presentation and questioned omissions. The family issued a statement that emphasized philanthropy rather than specific disputes. 3 months later, a small exhibit displayed the sealed room items behind glass. The curatorial label attempted nuance. It presented the objects within a framework that included context, debate, and unanswered questions. Attendance increased. The city papers printed think pieces. School groups visited and asked questions that the textual archives did not fully answer. Some descendants attended and left quietly. The Preservation Commission convened to assess the program's impact on public understanding. Conversations shifted from accusation to complexity. 6 months on, the mansion had settled into an uneasy normal. The museum wing ran educational programs that connected youth to civic history and to the ethics of stewardship. A community studio occupied a rear wing and hosted workshops on preservation craft. The sealed room artifacts were digitized and made accessible online. Yet rumors persisted, and critics reminded the public that architecture and legacy are ongoing conversations, not closed files. The mansion's physical presence continued to provoke questions about how wealth makes history and how history is then curated. As we close the doors on this exploration, it remains clear that the Madison Avenue mansion is more than limestone and porticos. It was a household that shaped ideas, and by doing so, allowed itself to be shaped. Architecture was both shelter and stage. Records and rooms forced decisions about memory and accountability. Preservation and disclosure were not neutral technical choices, but moral acts that continue to reverberate. If the walls could speak, they might ask of us what histories we want to enshrine and which we consign to silence. Share in the comments which room you would most want to see opened, and what question you would ask a portrait watching from its frame. If this story made you curious about how houses keep secrets, subscribe and join our exploration of mansions and the legacies they guard. Until the next doorstep, remember that a house is never only for those who live behind its doors. It is also for the city that circles it and for the future that must make sense of both its shadows and its light.